Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The cold that descended upon Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, in late January of 2008 was more than just a matter of weather. It was a deep, biting chill that seemed to seep from the frozen ground into the very bones of the small town, a harbinger of a darkness that would soon envelop the community in a shroud of grief and disbelief. On the surface, Bridgewater was a picture of maritime tranquility, a town of about 8,000 souls nestled along the banks of the La Have River. Life moved at a gentle pace, marked by the changing seasons and the quiet rhythms of a close-knit community. It was the kind of place where a missing child was an unthinkable horror, a nightmare belonging to the sprawling, anonymous cities far away. Within a modest apartment in this seemingly peaceful town, however, a different kind of cold had taken root. It was the coldness of resentment, of desperation, of a love that had become twisted into something monstrous. Here lived 34-year-old Penny Boudreau, a single mother, and her 12-year-old daughter, Carissa. Their relationship, like a wire stretched too taut, was strained to the breaking point. To the outside world, Penny was just another mother trying to make her way. But inside the walls of their home, the air was thick with tension, a constant, low-level hum of conflict between a mother and a daughter on the cusp of adolescence. Carissa was a typical 12-year-old girl. She had a winning smile and a love for animals, music, and the fleeting passions of a preteen. She was at an age of burgeoning independence, a time of testing boundaries and finding her own voice, a voice that often clashed with her mother's. She had lived for a time with her father, Paul Boudreau, in Shelburne County, but had recently moved back to Bridgewater to be with Penny. It was a decision that, in hindsight, would be a fatal one. The catalyst for the impending tragedy was a man, Penny's boyfriend, Vernon McCumber. Penny's relationship with McCumber had become the central focus of her life, an obsession that overshadowed all else, including her duty to her child. McCumber had moved in, and the small apartment became a pressure cooker of discord. He and Carissa did not get along. The arguments between mother and daughter, already frequent, escalated in volume and intensity, the sound of their screaming and hollering a regular disturbance for the neighbors. McCumber, caught in the crossfire, grew tired of the constant strife. He saw the fighting as unproductive and destabilizing. According to Penny, he delivered a cruel and devastating ultimatum, a choice that no mother should ever have to face. It's her or me. He wanted an end to the fighting. He wanted Penny to do something about the situation with her daughter. He simply wanted the family to function without the constant yelling. Penny heard his words as a decree. In her distorted perception, to keep her lover, she had to lose her daughter. For days, the poison of that choice seeped into Penny's mind. She began to consider the unthinkable, a plan so heinous it defied all natural law. She had two motives, prosecutors would later say. One was to save her faltering relationship with McCumber, and the other was to silence Carissa, to keep the girl from publicly calling her a bad mother. The daughter who was once the center of her world had become an obstacle, a problem to be eliminated. The love that should have been a shield had curdled into a weapon. Sunday, January 27, 2008, dawned cold and gray. A heavy snowstorm was bearing down on the region, threatening to blanket the landscape in a thick layer of white. For Penny Boudreau, the storm provided a perfect cover. She told Carissa they were going for a drive, a heart-to-heart, a chance to talk things out in the confines of the car where, as Penny later chillingly put it, Carissa can't get away and slam her door like she usually does. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, Penny drove her red Dodge Neon away from the familiar streets of Bridgewater. She headed towards the outskirts of town, to a deserted, snow-dusted spot on William Hebb Road in Hebbville. Before they left, she had retrieved a length of beige twine from the trunk and slipped it into her pocket, a small, terrible secret harbored against her body. They got out of the car, the cold air stinging their cheeks. The argument that had been simmering for weeks finally erupted in the desolate quiet of the remote road. But this was no ordinary mother-daughter spat. This was the endgame. In a sudden, violent movement, Penny lunged at her daughter, tackling the 12-year-old girl to the frozen, unforgiving ground. Carissa fell onto her back, the snow cushioning her fall, but offering no real comfort. Fear, stark and absolute, flooded Carissa's eyes. She was face to face with her own mother, the woman who had given her life, now a terrifying stranger with murder in her eyes. As Penny used her knees to pin the child's small body to the ground, Carissa's voice, small and trembling, cut through the frigid air with two simple, heart-shattering words. "Mommy, don't." It was a plea from the deepest well of a child's trust, a final, desperate appeal to the bond that should have been unbreakable. But Penny Boudreau was deaf to it. Her hands, which had once cradled her daughter, now wrapped the coarse twine around her slender neck. Carissa struggled, her small hands digging into the icy ground as she fought for breath, for life. Penny held on, her face a mask of grim determination, until the struggling ceased, until there was no more breathing, until her only child lay still and lifeless in the snow. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Penny's own ragged breaths. The deed was done, but the cold calculation did not end there. She dragged Carissa's body and placed it in the passenger side of the car, the place where her daughter had sat just moments before, alive and full of a life that Penny had just extinguished. She drove from the murder scene to a second location, a spot by the La Have River, its dark waters flowing sluggishly under a skin of ice. There, on the riverbank, she pulled her daughter's body from the car. In a final, grotesque act of deception, she pulled down Carissa's jeans and underwear, a deliberate attempt to stage the scene, to make investigators believe the girl had been the victim of assault. With that done, she rolled her daughter's small, partially undressed body over the edge of the embankment, leaving her to the mercy of the elements. She knew a heavy snow was coming. She was counting on it to hide her crime, to bury her secret deep beneath its cold, white blanket. Penny drove back into town, her mind a whirlwind of adrenaline and icy resolve. She stopped at the local swimming pool and threw several pieces of Carissa's clothing into a garbage can, methodically erasing her daughter's presence. She returned to the Sobeys grocery store, the centerpiece of her alibi. She bought juice and bacon. Then at 8:35 p.m., she made the call that would plunge the town of Bridgewater into a 2-week nightmare. She called the police and reported her 12-year-old daughter, Carissa Boudreau, missing. Her story was practiced and plausible. She told police they had argued in the car in the Sobeys parking lot. Carissa, angry, had refused to come into the store. Penny had gone in for just 15 minutes, and when she returned, her daughter was gone. It was a story of a runaway, a typical teenage rebellion that had taken a frightening turn. The community of Bridgewater, unsuspecting and compassionate, responded immediately. As the snow began to fall, police and family members began to search, their flashlights cutting futile beams through the swirling flakes. The next day, the search expanded. Carissa's picture was everywhere, plastered in storefronts, shared on the news, spreading across the internet. She was a pretty girl with shoulder-length brown hair and a tentative smile. The entire town, it seemed, was looking for her. 2 days after she had murdered her child, Penny Boudreau faced a bank of television cameras and microphones. Her eyes were swollen, her face a pale, drawn mask of anguish. She played the part of the distraught mother flawlessly. "I'm trying not to think the worst," she said, her voice choked with fabricated tears. "It's plain and simple hell. Not knowing where your kids are is horrible." She pleaded for her daughter to return. "Carissa, we love you," she urged. "We are all looking for you. Just come home or call or something." Researchers at Dalhousie University would later analyze her facial expressions during that press conference, noting the flicker of insincerity, the micro-expressions that betrayed the performance. But at that moment, the town of Bridgewater saw only a mother in pain. They opened their hearts and their wallets, raising money to help the family. Friends of Carissa, like Courtney Sardi, were terrified, sending messages to her on MSN, begging her to let someone know she was okay, never imagining the truth. For 13 agonizing days, the search continued. Helicopters chopped the air, police dogs sniffed through the snow, and divers braved the icy waters of the La Have River. There was no sign of Carissa. Penny continued her charade, attending a candlelight vigil, her presence a sickening mockery of the community's genuine grief. She and Vernon Macomber even attended Carissa's eventual funeral together. Then, on February 9th, the hopeful searching turned to horrified discovery. A passerby, walking along the bank of the La Have River in Conquerall Bank, saw something in the snow. It was a body. Carissa's frozen, partially clad body was found less than 5 minutes from the apartment where she had lived. The missing person case was now a homicide investigation. The shock that rippled through Bridgewater was seismic. The quiet town had not seen a murder since 1993. The fear was palpable, but so was the anger. The community that had embraced Penny in her supposed grief now looked at her with suspicion. Rumors began to circulate, vicious and dark, but they circled around a truth that was almost too monstrous to believe. The joint RCMP and Bridgewater police investigation immediately intensified. They were confident the murder was not random. Carissa knew her killer. Their focus soon fell on the volatile home life of Penny and her boyfriend. Neighbors reported hearing the couple arguing loudly after Carissa was found, and both Penny and Vernon were arrested on suspicion of murder. Vernon Macomber, terrified, told the police everything he could to help, but found himself accused. "I couldn't cooperate then. I was scared to death for me," he would later say. Investigators placed an undercover officer in a cell with him to gain his confidence. While they quickly cleared Macomber of any direct involvement in the murder, the investigation locked firmly onto Penny Boudreau. They were certain she was the killer, but they had no physical evidence, no murder weapon, and no confession. They had only suspicion. Faced with a calculating killer who had almost convinced an entire town of her innocence, investigators decided to employ one of the most controversial and elaborate tools in their arsenal: the Mr. Big sting operation. The plan was to create a fictitious criminal organization and lure Penny into its world, making her believe she was dealing with powerful gangsters who could make her legal problems disappear. For months, undercover officers worked to build a relationship with Penny. They gained her trust, presenting themselves as members of a crime syndicate. They offered her a deal, a test of her loyalty. If she performed a task for them, another fabricated crime, their powerful boss, the enigmatic Mr. Big, would use his influence to destroy any evidence the police had against her in Carissa's murder. Penny, desperate and believing she had found a way out, took the bait. In June 2008, she met with the man she believed was the head of the organization. Not realizing she was being recorded by hidden cameras, she recounted the entire, horrific story of how she murdered her daughter. She reenacted the crime, demonstrating how she had pinned Carissa to the ground, knelt on her chest, and strangled the life out of her. She left no detail out, her confession a chilling, first-hand account of a mother's ultimate betrayal. With the confession captured on tape, the trap snapped shut. On June 13, 2008, for months after her daughter's body was found, Penny Boudreau was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. When she was escorted from the courthouse, crowds jeered and yelled profanities, their previous sympathy now a burning, white-hot rage. On January 30th, 2009, exactly 1 year after she made her first tearful, public plea for her daughter's return, Penny Boudreau stood in a Bridgewater courtroom. To avoid a lengthy trial and the uncertainty of a jury, she agreed to plead guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. Dressed in a black t-shirt and jeans, she broke down in court, uttering a single hollow phrase, "I'm sorry." Carissa's father, Paul Boudreau, dismissed the apology as crocodile tears. As prosecutor Paul Scoville read the agreed statement of facts, The courtroom was filled with the sounds of sobbing from Carissa's relatives. They heard the grim details of the ultimatum, the drive to the deserted road, the strangulation with twine, and their beloved Carissa's final, haunting words, "Mommy, don't." Justice Margaret Stewart, looking directly at the woman who had committed this unthinkable crime, delivered a sentence as scathing as it was just. She sentenced Penny Boudreau to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 20 years. "You can never call yourself mother in conjunction with Carissa's name again," the judge stated, her voice resonating with moral authority. The words, "Mommy, don't," from a trusting and loving Carissa are there to haunt you for the rest of your life. The case left deep scars on everyone it touched. Vernon McCumber, though cleared of involvement, was left heartbroken and struggled to find work due to his connection to the case. Carissa's father was left to grapple with an unbearable loss and the knowledge of his ex-girlfriend's monstrous act. The town of Bridgewater, having mourned the girl they had adopted as Bridgewater's daughter, was forever changed, its innocence shattered. Years later, the name Penny Boudreau would resurface, reopening old wounds. Serving her sentence at the Nova Institution for Women, she became eligible to apply for escorted and unescorted leaves from prison. Each application, each parole board hearing, brought the horror of the case back into the public consciousness, provoking outrage and reminding the community of the little girl who was sacrificed for her mother's selfish desires. The chill that fell over Bridgewater in January 2008 never truly left. It lingers as a ghostly reminder of a mother's betrayal and a daughter's last, unanswered plea. Story 2. In the summer of 2023, in a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Milan called Cologno Monzese, a 20-year-old woman named Sofia Castelli was preparing for what should have been an ordinary night out with her closest friend. She had her whole life ahead of her, the kind of life still being sketched in pencil rather than ink, full of possibility and the small, ordinary joys of being young. Nights dancing with friends, plans for the future, a family who loved her deeply. What none of them could have known, as Sophia laughed and readied herself for a night at a Milanese disco called the Beach Club, was that somewhere in her own home, hidden inside a closet in her parents' bedroom, a young man who had once called himself her boyfriend was already waiting for her, patient and silent, in the dark. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Sofia Castelli would be dead, and the story of how she died would come to be understood across Italy as one of the starkest and most painful examples of a pattern the country had been forced to confront again and again. A young woman killed not by a stranger, not by random chance, but by someone who had once claimed to love her and could not accept that she had chosen to leave. Sofia lived with her parents in Cologno Monzese, a town just northeast of Milan, in an apartment on Corso Roma. She had, over the previous months, ended a relationship with a young man named Zaccaria Kawi, 23 years old, an Italian citizen of Moroccan descent. Their relationship had not ended quietly or without difficulty. Sofia had made her choice clear. She wanted to be free, to reclaim her time and her friendships, to move forward with her life without him in it. For a period during the pandemic, Kawi had actually lived with Sofia's family, welcomed into their home during a difficult and uncertain time, which made what followed all the more devastating, a betrayal of trust that ran far deeper than the end of a romance alone. He knew the layout of that apartment intimately. He knew where things were kept, how the household moved through its rooms, and crucially, he still had access to a set of keys that prosecutors would later say he had taken or duplicated through deception in the time since their breakup. On the night of July 28, 2023, into the early hours of July 29th, Sofia's parents were away, traveling to Sardinia to celebrate their wedding anniversary. Sofia had originally planned to join them there, but instead she stayed behind in Milan, choosing to spend the evening with her best friend, Aurora Fiamini. It was meant to be a carefree night, dancing and laughing at a nightclub, the kind of evening young women in their 20s are supposed to be able to enjoy without fear inside their own homes. While Sofia and Aurora danced the night away at the beach club, unaware that anything was wrong, Zaccaria at Kawi made his move. Around midnight, using the keys he still possessed, he entered Sophia's family apartment. He had gone there with a specific and disturbing plan already forming in his mind. Followed, he hid inside a closet in Sophia's parents' bedroom, the same closet where he would remain, motionless and waiting for hours. That his original intention had been to surprise Sophia with another man present, an act of jealous confrontation aimed at catching her in a moment of intimacy with someone new. It was, by his own account, jealousy that drove him there that night, jealousy over the fact that Sophia had moved on, that she had reclaimed a life that no longer included him. But that is not what happened. Sophia returned home in the early morning hours, sometime around 6 o'clock, accompanied not by a new romantic partner, but by Aurora, her best friend. The two young women, tired after their night out, made a small, ordinary decision that would carry devastating consequences. Because Aurora needed to wake up earlier than Sophia the next day, they decided to sleep in separate rooms rather than share a bed as friends often do after a long night. Sophia went to sleep in her parents' bedroom. Aurora settled into another room nearby, unaware that anyone else was in the apartment at all. Neither young woman knew that Zaccaria at Kawi was still there, still hidden, still waiting inside that closet, close enough to hear them return, close enough to hear the apartment fall quiet as exhaustion finally pulled them both into sleep. Once Sophia had fallen asleep, he stepped out of the closet and went to the kitchen to retrieve a knife. He examined it, decided it was not the right one for what he intended to do, and returned it, choosing instead what he described as a better, more suitable knife. It was an account so calculated, so devoid of the impulsive panic one might expect from a crime of passion, that it would later become central to the prosecution's argument that this had been no sudden outburst of emotion, but a premeditated act of violence planned well in advance. With the knife in hand, Kawi returned to the bedroom where Sophia lay sleeping. He attacked her while she slept, stabbing her repeatedly, at least 5 times by his own admission, though the eventual count established by investigators would rise to 8 wounds in total. The fatal blows struck her throat. Sophia Castelli, 20 years old, was killed in her own bed, in her parents' room, inside the home where she should have been safest, by someone who had once been trusted enough to live under that same roof. In the room next door, Aurora Fiamini slept through it all, entirely unaware of the horror unfolding just beyond the wall, a detail that would haunt her in the months and years that followed, the unbearable proximity of having been so close and yet powerless to know, let alone prevent, what was happening to her closest friend. What followed was almost as unsettling as the crime itself. Zaccaria at Kawi did not flee into hiding, nor did he attempt to construct an elaborate cover story. Instead, in the early morning hours after the killing, having spent roughly 7 hours total inside that apartment, he walked out with blood on him and went directly to local police headquarters, where he confessed to the murder. His confession set into motion an investigation led by the Carabinieri of Sesto San Giovanni, coordinated by prosecutor Emma Gambardella, who quickly moved to establish the full circumstances of the crime. Akawi remained in custody, first questioned for hours by investigators, and then brought before a judge for a validation hearing, where the question of premeditation, a legal aggravating factor with serious implications for his eventual sentence, became the central point of contention. During that initial hearing, presided over by the JIP, or Preliminary Investigations Judge, Elena Secchi, Akawi offered his direct, unflinching account of the night's events. How he had entered the apartment planning to surprise Sophia with another man, how he hid in the closet for hours, how he selected and reselected a knife with almost surgical deliberation, and how he ultimately killed her as she slept beside her unknowing friend in the next room. It was a confession delivered with a strange, disquieting composure, the kind of detailed narration that left little room for doubt about what had happened, even as it raised deeply uncomfortable questions about the mind capable of planning and carrying out such an act. News of Sophia's murder spread quickly across Italy, striking a particularly painful chord in a country that had, in recent years, been forced repeatedly to confront the epidemic of what Italians call femminicidio, the killing of women specifically because they are women, often by partners or former partners unable to accept rejection or separation. Sophia's case fit this pattern with devastating clarity. A young woman who had done nothing more than end a relationship and try to move forward with her life, killed by the very person who could not accept that choice. Her family demanded answers, and more than that, demanded acknowledgement of the full weight of what had been taken from them. In public statements following the arrest, they spoke of a daughter who wanted simply to live freely, to be the master of her own time and her own friendships, ordinary desires that should never have cost a young woman her life. The legal proceedings against Zaccaria at Kawi moved forward at the Court of Assizes in Monza, opening in earnest in January 2024. Prosecutors charged him with aggravated voluntary homicide, citing multiple serious aggravating circumstances. Premeditation, the fact that the crime arose from an intimate relationship, the use of what Italian law terms an insidious means, referring to the method of attacking Sophia while she slept and defenseless, and additionally what were described as base or trivial motives underlying the killing. At the first hearing, held on January 19, 2024, Akawi appeared before the court as the confessed perpetrator of the crime, with his defense team pursuing a strategy centered on requesting a psychiatric evaluation, an effort aimed at avoiding the maximum possible sentence of life imprisonment, known in Italy as ergastolo. The defense's hope was that a finding regarding his mental state at the time of the killing might introduce mitigating circumstances capable of reducing his eventual punishment. Throughout the trial, prosecutors argued forcefully for a life sentence, presenting the calculated nature of the crime, the hours spent waiting in the closet, the deliberate selection of a weapon, the choice of a defenseless moment to attack, as evidence of a mind that had planned this killing with chilling clarity, rather than acted in a sudden fit of uncontrollable passion. The prosecution's case rested heavily on Akawi's own confession, whose level of methodical detail became, paradoxically, some of the strongest evidence against any claim of impulsive or diminished capacity. On April 12, 2024, the Court of Assizes in Monza delivered its verdict. The court found that all four aggravating circumstances alleged by the prosecution, premeditation, the intimate relationship between victim and perpetrator, the use of an insidious means of attack, and base motives, were indeed present, circumstances the court itself described in its written reasoning as defining a crime that was, in its words, particularly cruel. Yet despite recognizing the severity and calculated nature of the killing, the court ultimately determined that generic mitigating circumstances should be considered equivalent in weight to these aggravating factors, a legal balancing act that, under Italian sentencing law, prevented the aggravating circumstances from driving the sentence toward the maximum penalty of life imprisonment. Instead, Zaccaria Akawi was sentenced to 24 years in prison. For Sophia's family and friends, who had hoped for and expected a sentence of life imprisonment given the calculated brutality of the crime, the verdict landed as a second wound layered atop the first. Outside the courtroom, family members and friends reacted with visible anger and tears, voicing a sentiment that would echo across Italian media coverage of the case in the days that followed. That a sentence of 24 years, however substantial it might sound in isolation, did not feel commensurate with a life so deliberately and completely taken. "This is not justice," relatives and supporters said outside the court, a phrase that captured the raw, unresolved grief of a family who had lost their daughter to a crime the court itself had acknowledged was particularly cruel, yet had not punished with the maximum severity the law allowed. The formal reasoning behind the Monza court's sentencing decision was published months later, on June 27, 2024, offering a detailed legal explanation for how a case involving four proven aggravating circumstances and a description of the crime as especially brutal could still result in a sentence short of life imprisonment. For legal observers and advocates working on issues of gender-based violence in Italy, the case became part of a broader, ongoing conversation about whether existing sentencing frameworks adequately reflect the severity of femicide cases, particularly when courts apply generic mitigating factors that offset even multiple proven aggravating circumstances. For those who knew Sofia Castelli, none of this legal architecture could restore what had been lost. She was 20 years old, a young woman who had simply wanted to live on her own terms, to go dancing with her best friend, to build a life unburdened by a relationship that had ended for reasons that were entirely her right to decide. Her best friend Aurora, who had slept unknowingly in the next room while the attack took place, has had to carry the particular anguish of that proximity, a nearness to tragedy that offered no chance to help and no way to have known. A year after Sofia's death, at a memorial held at the communal cemetery in Colonial Monzese, her community gathered not simply to mourn, but to insist that her name and her story continue to mean something, a warning and a testament both, spoken in her own imagined voice, that she had been killed by the person who claimed to love her, and that such a thing should never be allowed to happen quietly or be forgotten. Story 3. The wind off the Strait of Belle Isle does not knock politely. It arrives in long, cold sheets that rattle windows and bend the black spruce trees along the great northern peninsula, and on the night of November 30th, 2016, it was blowing hard against the small wooden houses of St. Anthony, Newfoundland. This is a town of about 2,000 people, a place where the harbor freezes early and the fishing boats sit hauled up on their trailers through the long winter, where everyone knows everyone else's truck by the sound of its engine, and where the biggest news of the year is usually the weather. But on this particular night, in a modest house on Husky Drive, something happened that would take almost a decade to come fully into the light, and when it did, it would leave the whole province asking how a woman could vanish so completely, and how her husband could keep a secret buried in the cold Atlantic water for so many years. Her name was Jennifer Hillier-Penny. She was 38 years old, a mother of 2 young daughters, a woman with a life that, from the outside, looked like it was simply going through a rough patch that so many marriages go through. She and her husband, Dean Penny, had been separating. It was not a secret in their small community. These things rarely are. Jennifer had already moved out of the family home and was living with her father, taking the difficult but common steps so many women take when a marriage begins to end, finding safety and support with family while the details of a separation get worked out. But marriages, even ending ones, rarely sever every thread at once, especially when there are children involved. There were still the everyday logistics of shared parenthood to manage, the small negotiations of who would watch the kids and when, and it was one of these ordinary, mundane arrangements that brought Jennifer back to the house on Husky Drive on the evening of November 30th. Dean was going hunting. He needed someone to stay with their youngest daughter. Jennifer, as mothers do, said yes. It should have been an unremarkable evening. A woman looking after her child in a house she had once called home, waiting for the father to return from a hunting trip at a cabin the family owned in nearby Northwest Arm. But at some point that evening, Jennifer Hillier-Penny disappeared, and she was never seen again. For years, nobody outside a small circle of investigators and family members knew what had truly happened inside that house. The public story, for a long time, was simply this. A young mother had vanished into thin air on a dark November night, leaving behind 2 daughters, a grieving father, and a community that could not make sense of it. There was no body. There was no confession. There was, for 7 long years, no answer at all. In the days and weeks that followed Jennifer's disappearance, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Newfoundland and Labrador opened an investigation that would eventually become one of the most expensive and painstaking in the province's history. Officers descended on St. Anthony, a town unaccustomed to this kind of scrutiny, and began the grim, methodical work of trying to determine what had happened to a woman who seemed to have vanished without a trace. Investigators poured over the house on Husky Drive. On December 7, 2016, just a week after Jennifer went missing, RCMP officers seized swabs, pillowcases, and bedsheets from Dean Penny's home. Later that month, their attention turned to a vehicle connected to Penny and to the cabin in Northwest Arm, where he said he had been hunting the night his wife disappeared. On December 17th, officers collected 131 swabs, 2 strands of hair, a pair of chest waders, knitted mittens, and 3 gloves from that vehicle. Every one of these items, seemingly small and unremarkable on their own, would become a thread in a case that took years to weave into something resembling the truth. According to what investigators would later piece together, and what would eventually be estimated in reporting on the case, Jennifer likely disappeared not long after she arrived at the house that evening, perhaps as early as 8 o'clock. From very early in the investigation, RCMP believed they were not looking for a missing person who might simply return. They believed, quietly and grimly, that Jennifer had been murdered. But belief is not evidence, and for years the case sat in a kind of agonizing limbo. Investigators suspected foul play. They suspected, though they never said so publicly, that Dean Penny knew more than he was telling them. But suspicion without proof cannot bring a charge, and it certainly cannot bring a family closure. Meanwhile, the human cost of this uncertainty was enormous and largely invisible to the outside world. 2 little girls grew up without their mother, their childhoods shaped by an absence nobody could explain to them in any way that made sense. Jennifer's father, who had taken her in during the separation, was left with nothing but questions and an empty chair at every holiday table. A community that prides itself on closeness and mutual care had to learn to live alongside a wound that would not close, a woman who had simply stopped existing in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday evening. Search efforts continued sporadically over the years. Land was scoured. Divers and search teams combed waterways near St. Anthony. The Canadian Navy would eventually become involved, along with specialized underwater recovery teams, all searching for some trace, some fragment of evidence that could tell Jennifer's family what had become of her. But the Atlantic Ocean is vast and unforgiving, and it kept its secrets. What the public did not know, during those 7 quiet years when the case seemed to have gone cold, was that the RCMP had not stopped working. They had instead begun one of the longest and most elaborate undercover operations in the province's history, a covert investigation that would eventually be known as Project Brusque. This kind of operation is sometimes called a Mr. Big Sting, a technique used by Canadian police in which undercover officers slowly and carefully build a relationship with a suspect, eventually presenting themselves as members of a fictitious criminal organization. The suspect is drawn in gradually, given small tasks, made to feel valued and trusted, flattered by the sense that he has been welcomed into something powerful and important. Over time, the operation builds toward a moment where the suspect is told that in order to be fully accepted into this criminal fraternity, in order to be trusted with bigger opportunities, he must prove himself honest with the group's leadership, often called Mr. Big, about his past. It is, in essence, a psychological long game, and it can take years to construct trust so convincing that a person will confess even to the worst things they have ever done. For Dean Penny, this operation stretched across more than 4 years. Undercover officers, posing as members of this fictitious criminal enterprise, slowly built a relationship with him, drawing him into their world piece by piece. It is difficult to imagine the discipline this required. Officers living inside false identities for years, maintaining a fiction so consistent and so believable that a man who would eventually feel comfortable enough, or perhaps desperate enough for acceptance, to describe it all in detail to the very people investigating him. The operation culminated in November 2023, almost exactly 7 years after Jennifer disappeared. In a moment steeped in an eerie symmetry that nobody could have scripted, on November 30th, 2023, exactly 7 years to the day since Jennifer Hillier Penny vanished, Dean Penny sat across from a man he believed to be a powerful crime boss and, in a moment captured on video, described what he had done to his estranged wife. What Penny told this man, a person only ever publicly identified by the name Rudy, and later, according to reporting, this same undercover network, was chilling in its specificity. He described returning to his house that night to pick up duck decoys before heading out on his hunting trip. He said he parked down the road, away from the house, because he did not want to startle his estranged wife, who was inside with their daughter. But Jennifer heard him come in anyway, and an argument broke out between them. According to what Penny described, in the heat of that argument, he pushed her, and she fell down a set of stairs. In one version of events he gave to the undercover officers, this fall was framed almost as an accident, a tragic consequence of a moment of anger rather than a premeditated act. He then described, in his own words, what he did next. He said he concealed her body, kept the truth hidden from their own daughter who had been in the house at the time, and ultimately transported her by boat out into the bay near his cabin, disposing of her body in the ocean. Penny's own words carried a chilling finality. He had taken her, moved her, transported her by boat out into the bay near his cabin, and left her there. "That's where she remains," he said. "She will never be found. That's all I can disclose." It is worth pausing here to consider the sheer weight of those words, spoken not in a moment of panic to police, but confidently, almost proudly, to men he believed were criminals impressed by displays of ruthlessness. For 7 years, a family had grieved without answers, a community had wondered, and searchers had combed land and sea, all while the truth sat, according to his own account, at the bottom of a bay near a hunting cabin, spoken aloud only because a man wanted to prove his loyalty to a criminal organization that did not actually exist. On December 15, 2023, Dean Penny, then 50 years old, was arrested by the RCMP and charged with first-degree murder in the death of his estranged wife. At a news conference announcing the charge, RCMP Inspector Tracy Edwards spoke carefully about the years of work that had led to this moment. 7 years of investigative diligence have brought us to this point, she said. From the beginning, our goal has been to get answers for Jennifer's loved ones and to bring anyone responsible for her disappearance to justice. She extended, on behalf of the RCMP, condolences to Jennifer's family and friends, acknowledging plainly what everyone in St. Anthony had likely already come to fear, that Jennifer was gone, and that 7 years was an agonizingly long time to wait for that confirmation. Her remains, despite everything, had still not been found. More than 2 years after his arrest, in the spring of 2026, Dean Penny's trial finally began. Jury selection opened on April 1st in Corner Brook Supreme Court, and by then Penny was 53 years old, a decade removed from the night his wife disappeared. He had pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder, and his defense team made clear from the outset that they intended to challenge the very foundation of the Crown's case, the confessions themselves. The defense argued that what Penny had told the undercover officers could not be trusted as truth. Mr. Big operations, while legal in Canada, are controversial precisely because of the psychological pressure they place on a suspect, the incentive structure that rewards boasting and exaggeration, and the very real possibility that a person might confess to something dramatic simply to gain status or acceptance within a group he has been carefully, patiently groomed to want to impress. Penny's lawyer, Jeff Brace, argued there was no reliable evidence tying his client to any wrongdoing, and pointed out that despite years of searching, there was still no indication, no physical proof, that Jennifer Hillier Penny was even dead. But the Crown's case was not built on the confessions alone. Forensic investigators had continued their work over the years, and during the trial, evidence emerged that a forensic examination of Penny's garage in St. Anthony had detected Jennifer's DNA, although investigators could not confirm the presence of blood in the room. It was not a conclusive piece of evidence on its own, but combined with the recorded confessions, layered together with years of circumstantial detail, it added another thread to the case the Crown was building. The trial itself stretched on for nearly 2 months, an unusually long and difficult process for a small province's court system. Jurors were shown video recordings, the same recordings in which Penny had described the argument, the fall, the hammer, the boat, the bay. Video that came with warnings attached for its graphic content, because in it, Penny did not simply confess in vague terms. He reenacted in detail, for an undercover officer, exactly how he said he had struck his wife, describing the moment with a clarity that left little room for the jury to imagine it as anything other than what it was. A man describing, step by step, how he killed her. The defense continued to hammer at the reliability of these confessions throughout the trial, suggesting they were the product of a manufactured criminal fantasy rather than a genuine, reliable account of what had happened. But the Crown countered that the sheer specificity and consistency of what Penny had described, across multiple separate conversations with undercover officers over an extended period, spoke to their authenticity in a way that mere boasting could not explain. Closing arguments came in mid-May. The Crown laid out its case methodically, walking the jury through the timeline. The disappearance in 2016, the years of searching, the DNA evidence in the garage, the confessions recorded over the course of Project Brusque, and the terrible consistency between what Penny had told the undercover officers on separate occasions months apart. The defense, in turn, spent hours arguing the opposite, that there was no body, no confirmed blood, no witness, nothing beyond the word of a man who may have simply wanted to seem dangerous and important to people he believed held power over his future in a criminal underworld that never actually existed. The jury began its deliberations in the final days of May 2026. It was not a quick decision. For 4 days and nights, the 12 jurors weighed the evidence, wrestling, it seems, with exactly the tension the defense had tried to create. How much weight to give a confession made not to police under caution, but to a fictional criminal boss, constructed carefully over years by undercover officers. At one point during their deliberations, the jury asked to re-watch the confession videos again, this time without the blurring that had obscured the face of the undercover officer posing as the crime boss, so that they could study Penny's own facial expressions as he spoke. It was a small but telling detail, suggesting that the jury was trying to read not just his words, but his truthfulness in the subtle language of his face as he described killing his wife. On the morning of May 24, 2026, in Corner Brook, the jury returned. After nearly 2 months of testimony and 4 days of careful, weighty deliberation, the 12 jurors delivered their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. They had concluded unanimously that Dean Penny had killed Jennifer Hillier Penny, and that the killing had been planned and deliberate, the legal threshold required for a first-degree conviction rather than a lesser charge. The courtroom, by all accounts, absorbed the verdict in the particular hush that follows the end of a decade-long wait for truth. Jennifer's family, who had endured 7 years of not knowing, and then more than 2 additional years of a slow-moving legal process, finally had the answer the RCMP had promised. Under Canadian law, a conviction for first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Dean Penny, now in his 50s, faces the certainty of growing old and eventually dying in prison for what he did, a consequence that, while it can never truly repay what was taken from Jennifer's daughters and family, at least closes the chapter of uncertainty that had defined this case for nearly a decade. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for later in the year. In the aftermath of the verdict, RCMP officials spoke about what the investigation had demanded of them. Inspector Adam Palmer noted that the lengthy investigation, spanning the initial search efforts, the years of forensic work, and ultimately the elaborate, multi-year undercover sting operation, had required roughly 100 officers and staff of all ranks, making it one of the most resource-intensive investigations in the province's history. The RCMP, in a public statement, said they welcome and respect the guilty verdict, a measured but clearly relieved response from investigators who had carried this case, in one form or another, for nearly a decade. There is something profoundly sobering about the arithmetic of this case. 7 years of searching before an arrest, more than 2 additional years before a trial, nearly 2 months of testimony, and still, after all of it, no recovered body, no final resting place for Jennifer, no grave her daughters can visit. Justice, in the legal sense, has been done. Dean Penny will spend at minimum the next 25 years in prison. But justice in the fullest human sense, the kind that allows a family to say a final goodbye, remains incomplete, because the ocean that Dean Penny chose as Jennifer's unmarked grave has, so far, refused to give her back. What lingers, beyond the courtroom drama and the undercover operation and the DNA swabs and the years of careful investigative patience, is the image of an ordinary evening that went catastrophically wrong. A mother who came to a house she used to call home simply to watch her daughter for a few hours while her estranged husband went hunting, and who never left that house alive. It is a story that offers no comfort, only the smallest, hardest-won kind of resolution, the knowledge, finally, of who was responsible. Even as the deepest wound, the absence of Jennifer herself, remains permanently, tragically open. Her daughters grew up without her. Her family waited a decade for an answer. And a small town on the edge of the Atlantic learned, in the most painful way possible, that even the coldest, quietest cases can eventually surface, carried up not by luck, but by the patient, relentless work of people who refuse to let a missing woman become a forgotten one. Story 4. The morning of November 2nd, 2016, began like countless others in Redding, California, a quiet town tucked into the foothills of the Shasta Cascade region, where pine-covered mountains rise behind modest suburban streets and life tends to move at an unhurried pace. Sherry Papini, 34 years old and mother to 2 small children, laced up her running shoes and stepped out of her house for what was, by all accounts, a routine morning jog. She had done this many times before. Her husband, Keith Papini, had grown accustomed to her disappearing down the road for exercise and returning within the hour, ready to start the day with their children. But on this particular morning, Sherry did not come back. As the hours stretched on, worry crept into the household. Keith tried calling her phone, but there was no answer. He drove the route she usually took, scanning the roadside for any sign of her, but found nothing. By the time he called the Shasta County Sheriff's Office to report her missing, the quiet unease had hardened into something closer to dread. What the Papini family and the investigators who soon converged on their home could not have known was that this single missing persons report would ignite a national manhunt, dominate headlines for weeks, and eventually unravel into one of the most talked-about hoaxes in modern American crime history. In the days that followed Sherry's disappearance, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, working alongside the FBI, launched an intensive search operation. Search parties combed the wooded areas near the Papini home. Volunteers passed out flyers with Sherry's photograph, a young mother with warm eyes and an easy smile, hoping someone somewhere had seen her. Law enforcement pulled surveillance footage from businesses, churches, motels, and traffic cameras across 2 counties, and issued roughly 20 search warrants for phone records and camera data, trying to piece together her final movements before she vanished. Keith Papini became the face of a grieving family clinging to hope. He spoke to reporters, his voice breaking as he pleaded for his wife's safe return, describing her as a devoted mother who would never willingly leave her children behind. The story spread quickly through local and then national media. A seemingly ordinary woman had gone out for a jog and simply disappeared into thin air, leaving behind 2 young children who would wake up every morning asking why their mother was not there to greet them. Sheriff Tom Bosenko, who oversaw the investigation in its early stages, told reporters that his office had no reason to disbelieve that something terrible had happened to Sherry. Investigators began looking into her past, including a previous marriage, hoping to uncover any leads that might explain her sudden disappearance. But for 3 long weeks, there was nothing. No sightings, no ransom demands, no clues. Just an aching silence that spread through the community and across the airwaves of cable news networks, which had begun to cover the case around the clock. Then, on the morning of Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, 2016, everything changed. A motorist driving along Interstate 5 in northern Yolo County spotted a woman stumbling along the roadside, roughly 150 miles from the Papini home. She was emaciated, her wrists and body marked by restraints, and she appeared to have been badly beaten. It was Sherry Papini. She was rushed to a hospital, where doctors treated her for her injuries. When she was finally able to speak with investigators, she recounted a horrifying story. She said she had been abducted at gunpoint while jogging by 2 women driving a dark-colored SUV. According to her account, the women had held her captive for 22 days, chained her, physically abused her, and eventually released her, leaving her to find her way back to civilization along the highway. For a family that had spent 3 weeks fearing the worst, Sherry's return felt like a miracle answered on the one day of the year devoted to gratitude. Keith Papini described the reunion as the happiest moment of his life, embracing his wife amid a flood of relief and disbelief. The nation, having followed the case obsessively for weeks, exhaled along with them. News outlets ran headlines celebrating the safe return of the young mother, and well-wishers from across the country sent messages of support and even financial donations to help the family recover from their ordeal. A fund was established to help cover medical costs and other expenses tied to Sherry's supposed captivity, and it swelled with contributions from strangers moved by her story. Yet even as the public celebrated, investigators harbored quiet doubts. Sherry's description of her captors was vague, and despite the sheriff's public assurances that there was no reason to disbelieve her, the physical evidence collected from the scene and from her body did not fully align with the story she told. Detectives noted inconsistencies almost immediately, though they chose not to air these suspicions publicly while the investigation continued. The case remained technically open, listed as an unsolved kidnapping, even as years passed and the initial media frenzy faded into memory. Behind the scenes, however, a team of investigators pressed forward, unwilling to let the case go cold. They continued analyzing DNA evidence recovered from Sherry's clothing at the time of her return, evidence that did not match any known assailant in law enforcement databases. For years, the DNA sample sat as an unresolved thread, a silent clue waiting for technology and patience to catch up with it. That breakthrough finally arrived in 2020, nearly 4 years after Sherry's initial disappearance, when investigators turned to a relatively new tool in criminal investigations: genetic genealogy. This method, which had already helped crack other long-dormant cases across the country, allowed investigators to trace partial genetic matches through public ancestry databases, building family trees to identify unknown suspects from small biological samples. Applying this technique to the DNA found on Sherry's clothing, investigators were led, remarkably, not to a stranger, not to one of the mysterious Hispanic women she had described, but to a man named James Reyes, Sherry's former boyfriend from years before her marriage to Keith. The discovery of Reyes's connection to the case sent investigators down an entirely new path, one that would ultimately dismantle the story the public had believed for years. When confronted, Reyes did not deny knowing Sherry or having contact with her during the period she was reported missing. But his account of what happened was starkly different from the tale of kidnapping and captivity that Sherry had told. According to Reyes, Sherry had come to him during the very weeks she was supposedly being held against her will, not as a victim seeking rescue, but as someone asking for his help. He told investigators that Sherry had confided in him that she was unhappy in her marriage, describing it as abusive, and had asked to stay with him at his residence in Costa Mesa, hundreds of miles south of Redding, in Southern California. Reyes said he agreed to let her stay, unaware that her family and an entire nation believed she had been abducted. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Reyes told investigators that Sherry had asked him to inflict visible injuries on her, wounds and bruises that she could later present as evidence of the abuse she claimed to have suffered at the hands of her fictional captors. He maintained that he had not orchestrated any kidnapping and had never been charged with any crime in connection with the case. Whether he fully understood the scope of what Sherry intended, or whether he was himself deceived about the reasons behind her requests, became a central and painful question that lingered over the case for years to come. Armed with the DNA match in Reyes's statements, along with rental car records, cell phone data, and other physical evidence, investigators began to reconstruct what had truly happened during those 22 days in November 2016. The story that emerged was almost impossible for many to reconcile with the grieving, terrified woman found on the roadside on Thanksgiving morning. Sherry Papini had not been kidnapped by anyone. She had voluntarily left her life behind, driven, according to investigators, by deeply personal and complicated motivations, and had spent her time in hiding at Reyes's apartment, hundreds of miles from the search parties combing the hills near her home. The physical injuries she displayed upon her return, the bruises, the marks from restraints, the branding like wound on her arm that had been widely reported in the media at the time, had not been inflicted by captors at all. Investigators determined that these injuries had either been self-inflicted or carried out with Reyes's assistance, at Sherry's own request, all in service of making her fabricated story appear credible to law enforcement, to her family, and to the millions of people following the case from afar. Shasta County Sheriff Michael Johnson, who had taken over the office since the case first began, later described Sherry's actions as driven by what he called narcissistic behavior, suggesting that the elaborate deception had been fueled by a need for attention and sympathy rather than any external threat. It was a stark and uncomfortable reassessment of a woman who, for years, had been publicly regarded as a victim deserving of compassion and support. On March 3, 2022, more than 5 years after Sherry Papini's initial disappearance, federal agents arrested her at her home in Redding. She was charged with making false statements to federal law enforcement officers and with mail fraud, the latter charge stemming from her acceptance of financial assistance and victim compensation funds that had been distributed to her based on her false claims of victimhood. The charges laid bare, in cold legal language, what investigators had pieced together over years of painstaking work. A criminal complaint detailed 34 counts of mail fraud alongside the charge of lying to federal agents, reflecting the sheer scale of the deception and the public resources it had consumed. Sherry now faced the prospect of a trial that would force her, and the country that had once rallied behind her, to confront the truth of what had actually happened during those 22 days. Just over a month later, on April 18, 2022, Sherry Papini appeared before a federal court and entered a guilty plea. Rather than proceed to trial, she agreed to plead guilty to a single count of mail fraud and 1 count of making false statements to federal officers, as part of a plea agreement negotiated with prosecutors. In doing so, she formally admitted what investigators had suspected for years, and what her own family had likely begun to fear in private: that the harrowing kidnapping story that had captivated the nation was, in fact, a carefully constructed fabrication. As part of the agreement, Sherry also consented to repay more than $300,000, a sum meant to cover the substantial costs incurred by the various agencies that had dedicated time, personnel, and resources to searching for her and investigating her claims over the years. The restitution reflected not just a financial reckoning, but an acknowledgement of the real, tangible toll her actions had taken on public institutions and the people who had worked tirelessly, believing they were searching for a genuine kidnapping victim. On September 19, 2022, nearly 6 years after the day she vanished during her morning jog, Sherry Papini stood before a federal judge for sentencing. By then, she was 39 years old, and the case that had once generated waves of public sympathy had transformed into a story of public reckoning and, for many, a sense of betrayal. Prosecutors detailed how Papini had repeated her false story for over 4 years, even as investigators quietly worked to expose the truth behind her disappearance. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release, a sentence notably longer than what federal prosecutors had originally requested, reflecting perhaps the depth of public and institutional harm caused by the elaborate hoax. She was also formally ordered to pay $309,902 in restitution, funds that would go toward reimbursing the California Victim Compensation Board, the Social Security Administration, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the very agencies that had devoted years of work to a case built on a lie. For Keith Papini, the sentencing marked the painful culmination of a journey that had begun with what he believed was the worst day of his life, the disappearance of his wife, and had ended with an even more devastating revelation: that the woman he loved and the mother of his children had orchestrated an elaborate deception that consumed years of his life and the resources of an entire community. He has publicly and vehemently denied Sherry's earlier claims that their marriage had been abusive, claims she had used, according to investigators, to justify her flight to Reyes's home. Sherry Papini received early release from custody in August 2023, having served a portion of her 18-month sentence. For a time, she largely withdrew from public life, avoiding the media scrutiny that had once surrounded her so intensely. Her children, who had been small when their mother first disappeared and then dramatically returned, grew up in the shadow of a case that remained a subject of fascination for true crime audiences, documentary filmmakers, and journalists long after the legal proceedings had concluded. But the story did not end quietly. In the years following her release, Sherry Papini once again began asserting publicly that she had, in fact, been a genuine victim of abduction, this time pointing directly at James Reyes as her true abductor. She maintained that Reyes had kidnapped her against her will and was responsible for the injuries she suffered, directly contradicting the plea agreement she had signed years earlier, admitting the entire kidnapping had been fabricated. Reyes, for his part, has consistently denied any wrongdoing and has never faced criminal charges related to the case. Investigators who worked the case for years found no corroborating evidence to support Sherry's renewed claims, and her assertions have been met with skepticism by many who followed the original investigation closely, given that she had already pleaded guilty under oath to fabricating the entire event. The Sherry Papini case endures as a haunting example of how a single act of deception can ripple outward, consuming public resources, straining families, and eroding trust in ways that are difficult to fully repair. What began as a community's desperate hope for a missing mother's safe return transformed, over the course of 6 years, into a cautionary tale about the fragility of truth in an age of intense media attention and public sympathy. The FBI ultimately closed its investigation, having concluded that no genuine kidnapping had ever occurred, a resolution that offered little comfort to those who had spent weeks searching wooded hillsides, or to a community that had opened its heart and its wallets to a woman they believed had survived a brutal ordeal. For Keith Papini and his children, the case left behind questions that may never be fully answered, not about who took Sherry, since no one did, but about why someone they loved would construct such an elaborate and painful deception, and what, if anything, could ever restore the trust that was broken along the way. Sherry Papini's continued insistence, even after her guilty plea and imprisonment, that she was truly a victim of an abduction by Reyes ensures that her case remains unsettled in the minds of many. A story with a documented legal conclusion, but an emotional and psychological aftermath that refuses to close so neatly. It stands now as one of the more studied and debated hoax cases in recent American history, a reminder that behind headlines and viral news cycles are real families, real children, and real consequences that persist long after the cameras have moved on to the next story. Story 5. Louise Cam was, by every account of those who knew her, a woman who had built her life through decades of hard work. At 71 years old, she lived in Potter's Bar, Hertfordshire, a quiet town on the northern edge of London, and she had spent years quietly amassing a property portfolio worth millions of pounds. She was not a public figure, not someone whose name appeared in newspapers or society pages. She was a mother, a friend, a businesswoman who understood the value of property and had used that understanding to build genuine wealth. She had 2 sons, Richard and Gregory, whom she loved deeply, and a close circle of friends who admired her warmth and her sharp mind for business. Nothing about her life suggested that it would end in July 2021 with her body stuffed into a wheelie bin, dumped like refuse on a residential driveway in Harrow, North London. To understand how Louise Cam's story ended this way, it helps to understand the 2 men who entered her life earlier that year, men who saw in her not a person to respect, but a fortune to be taken. Sometime in early 2021, Louise was introduced to a young man named Kasai Aljundi, then 24 years old, through a mutual acquaintance. Aljundi worked at a kebab shop in Willesden, in northwest London, a modest job that gave no hint of the elaborate persona he was about to construct. To Louise, and to many others he would go on to deceive, Aljundi presented himself as something entirely different, a savvy property developer with access to serious money. He spoke of a wealthy girlfriend, a woman he described as a multimillionaire, who was prepared to fund the purchase of Louise's properties at a price well above their market value. It was, in every sense, a fiction. Aljundi had no assets of his own. There was no millionaire girlfriend waiting in the wings with a fortune to spend. One woman who came to know him during this period, a friend named Anna Reich, would later describe him in a phrase that captured the strange, restless nature of his lives. She called him something of a Walter Mitty, a reference to the classic fictional daydreamer who invents grand, imagined lives for himself. Aljundi did not simply exaggerate his circumstances to Louise. He wove an entire fictional world, one elaborate enough that he even convinced Anna Reich to hand over 2 cars to him during the course of their friendship, deceiving her just as thoroughly as he intended to deceive Louise. Alongside Aljundi worked Mohammed El Aboud, 28 years old, a Romanian national employed as a delivery driver. Where Aljundi appeared to be the architect of the scheme, weaving the lies and managing the relationships that would draw Louise deeper into the trap, El Aboud became his accomplice, someone who moved into the orbit of the plan and eventually into the house at the center of it. What makes the story of Louise Cam so unsettling is not a single dramatic act of violence appearing out of nowhere, but the patient, months-long construction of deceit that preceded it. Aljundi did not ask Louise to hand over her properties in one conversation. He built the request slowly, carefully, the way a con artist builds trust before asking for everything at once. He proposed that Louise's 2 properties, a house in Barnet worth well over £1 million along with additional flats and commercial holdings, be transferred to him. He framed this not as an act of generosity on her part, but as smart financial planning, telling her that gifting the properties to him would help her avoid stamp duty and other legal costs. In truth, the arrangement would have given him full legal ownership of everything she had built, without him ever paying a penny for it. As the plan progressed, Aljundi approached several solicitors to formalize the transaction. One after another, they refused to act, or insisted that Louise needed her own independent legal representation, recognizing instinctively that the deal carried enormous risk for her. It is a small, bitter detail of this case that even as professionals raised red flags about the arrangement, it was Louise herself, deceived and trusting, who ended up paying for the very legal services Aljundi was using in his attempt to defraud her. By the middle of July 2021, the scheme had progressed further than perhaps anyone around Louise realized. Aljundi had secured a signed power of attorney document from her, along with signed transfer forms for both of her properties. Her bank, growing suspicious of unusual financial activity, eventually refused to process further transfers connected to the arrangement, suspecting fraud. But by then, the damage to Louise's trust and her paperwork had already been done. Investigators thought such was the depth of Aljundi's manipulation that he had caused Louise to lie to her own bank and mortgage provider in order to keep the scheme moving forward, turning her into an unwitting participant in her own undoing. Those around Louise were not blind to what was happening. Her family and friends warned her repeatedly not to trust Aljundi, urging her to step back from the transaction and question the story she had been told. But Louise, it seems, believed that everything was legitimate, that the paperwork and the promises added up to a genuine business opportunity, rather than an elaborate trap closing slowly around her. By late July 2021, something shifted in Aljundi's plans. By July 26th, he had resolved to kill Louise Cam, and that this decision had crystallized days earlier, not in a single moment of panic, but through a series of calculated actions. On July 24th, 2 days before Louise's death, Aljundi purchased an expensive fireplace for the house at 16 Gallants Farm Road in Barnet, a property belonging to Louise. It was a strange and telling gesture, the act of a man already treating a house that was not his as though it belonged to him. The following day, he instructed his solicitor to prepare a document intended to falsely show that Louise had already entered into a contract and had already been paid for her properties, laying the groundwork for a cover story. That same day, he told his own mother that Louise Cam was dying of cancer and that he stood to inherit her assets through her will, a lie constructed, it seems, to explain away the wealth he expected to soon possess. Al-Jundi also told El Aboud that significant money would come from Louise's death, and that a share of it would be El Aboud's reward for carrying out the killing. It was an arrangement built on greed shared between two men, one who orchestrated the deception and one who agreed to become its instrument. On the morning of July 26, 2021, Louise Cam drove to the house on Gallant's Farm Road believing she was going to meet a solicitor and finalize the transfer of her properties. Despite every warning from the people who loved her, she seems to have genuinely believed the meeting was legitimate. At 3:02 in the afternoon, she spoke on the phone with her close friend Cami Rohani. An ordinary conversation, one of countless calls between two women who cared about each other, giving no indication that anything was wrong. It would be one of the last times anyone who loved her would hear her voice. Just 11 minutes later, at 3:13 p.m., Al-Jundi left the property with his girlfriend, a woman named Maria Amarukai, whom he had also deceived, professing love for her while concealing that he had a wife and 3 children. Investigators would later conclude that this departure was a deliberate act, an attempt to construct an alibi for the very moment Louise Cam was being killed. Inside the house at Gallant's Farm Road, Louise Cam was strangled. The instrument used was the cord of a hairdryer, wrapped around her neck and pulled tight. A violent struggle had taken place, that Louise had fought for her life in her final moments. She likely died within 30 to 40 seconds of the attack beginning. Her body was left in the house where she had been killed. In the chaotic aftermath, El Aboud moved Louise's car from the driveway and parked it out of view on a side street, an early attempt to erase any visible sign that something terrible had happened at the property. Al-Jundi, having already left with Maria to build his alibi, continued to distance himself from the scene, while El Aboud drove Maria home to Coventry before returning to London later that day. It was during that drive to Coventry that El Aboud told Maria what he had done. He described grabbing Louise from behind, an account that matched, with chilling precision, the way she had actually been killed. He told her that Al-Jundi had asked him to carry out the killing because Louise supposedly owed him £2 million, and that Al-Jundi had promised to share the proceeds with him. Maria did not take him seriously at the time, unable or unwilling to believe that the man beside her had just confessed to murder. What followed was a methodical and disturbing effort to erase Louise Cam from existence, not just physically, but from the awareness of everyone who loved her. Later that day, and into the early hours of the next morning, the two men wrapped her body in plastic bags and a duvet before placing it inside a wheelie bin at the Gallant's Farm Road property, covering it with garden waste to disguise what lay beneath. The following day, July 27th, they moved that same wheelie bin from Barnet to a residential street in Harrow, Wood End Road, placing it deliberately alongside other bins marked with the same house number, hoping the coincidence would help it disappear unnoticed among ordinary household rubbish, destined for a landfill where the truth might never be uncovered. Perhaps the cruelest part of what followed was the campaign of deception aimed directly at the people who loved Louise most. After the killing, the two men took her mobile phone and her bank cards. Using her phone, they sent messages to her family and closest friends, crafted to sound as though they came from Louise herself, claiming she had traveled to China. Her son Gregory received one such message, and something about its phrasing struck him as wrong, unnatural, not the way his mother would write. That instinct, a son's quiet recognition that something was deeply off, became one of the first threads that would eventually unravel the entire scheme. When Louise failed to reappear, and the messages continued to feel hollow and strange, her family reported her missing. Detective Chief Inspector Brian Howie took over the investigation, and police began piecing together her final movements. Her black BMW was recovered on July 28th in Edgware, abandoned and disconnected from the woman who had once driven it every day. Then, on August 1st, 2021, the case took its grim turn from a missing persons inquiry into a murder investigation. Louise Cam's body was discovered inside a wheelie bin on Wood End Road in Harrow, exactly where it had been left days earlier, hidden among the ordinary debris of a residential street. It was a discovery that transformed quiet concern into horror, confirming what perhaps her family had begun, in their most fearful moments, to suspect. Investigators soon identified Qusay al-Jundi and Mohammed El Aboud as suspects, both men who had worked together at the same kebab shop in Willesden, and who had, over the preceding months, wound themselves into Louise's life through an elaborate campaign of financial deception. As police began to examine the evidence, digital records, phone data, and CCTV footage from the areas surrounding both properties, the outline of what had truly happened to Louise Cam began to emerge with devastating clarity. Among the details that would later shock even hardened investigators and the public who followed the case was a piece of evidence almost too callous to comprehend. In the hours and days after killing Louise, El Aboud posted videos to social media, filming himself dancing with his girlfriend in the front driveway of the very house where the murder had taken place. He mocked the wealth that Louise had built over her lifetime, seemingly reveling in the trappings of a life he and al-Jundi had stolen through deceit and violence. Detective Chief Inspector Howie would later describe these videos as repulsive, a word that barely captured the cruelty of celebrating on the doorstep of a woman's murder while she lay dead nearby. The case against al-Jundi and El Aboud went to trial at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, in late 2022. Both men denied murdering Louise Cam, and each attempted to shift blame onto the other. Al-Jundi chose not to give evidence in his own defense, allowing his legal team to argue instead that El Aboud had been the true killer. El Aboud, for his part, did take the stand, but under questioning he was shown to have lied extensively about what he knew and what he had actually done on the day Louise died. The prosecution laid out a case built on months of financial records, text messages, phone data, and CCTV footage, painting a comprehensive picture of a fraud that spiraled into murder when the men's carefully constructed lies threatened to collapse. Witnesses including Anna Reich, the woman deceived out of 2 cars, and Maria Amarukai, the girlfriend who had unknowingly heard a confession to murder during a car ride to Coventry, gave testimony that helped the jury understand the full scope of the deception and violence that had unfolded. On January 19, 2023, after a trial that stretched across weeks, the jury returned its verdict. Both Qusay al-Jundi and Mohammed El Aboud were found guilty of the murder of Louise Cam. On February 1, 2023, the 2 men stood before His Honor Judge Mark Lucraft KC, the Recorder of London, at the Central Criminal Court for sentencing. The judge's remarks laid bare, in careful and measured legal language, the full arc of greed and cruelty that had defined the case. He described how al-Jundi had told Louise lie after lie, constructing a fictional identity as a wealthy man with a fictional multimillionaire girlfriend, purely to manipulate her into signing away everything she owned. Before passing sentence, the judge read moving impact statements submitted by Louise's son Gregory and her close friend Cami Rohani, both of whom spoke to how deeply Louise had been loved and admired. The judge noted plainly that a woman of 71, who had cared for her 2 sons throughout her life, had suffered brutal injuries at the hands of these men, who then treated her remains with complete disregard, discarding her body as though it were nothing more than household waste. Because the charge was murder, the law required a sentence of life imprisonment for both men, and the judge passed that sentence accordingly. The remaining question before the court was the minimum term each man would need to serve before becoming eligible for parole consideration. The judge set an initial starting point of 30 years, reflecting that the murder had been committed for financial gain. He then identified serious aggravating factors. The crime had been extensively planned over a lengthy period. It had taken place inside Louise's own home, where she should have felt safe, and extraordinary efforts had been made afterward to conceal her body, and to deceive her family and friends through fabricated messages sent from her own phone. The judge found no mitigating factors in the case beyond the men's relatively young ages and the absence of significant prior convictions. He determined that both Al-Jundi and El Aboud bore equal responsibility, declining to draw any distinction in sentencing between the man who had orchestrated the fraud and the man who had carried out the killing, since both had acted, in the judge's words, out of shared greed. Each man was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years, reduced slightly to account for time already spent in custody awaiting trial. The murder of Louise Cam is, at its core, a story about the vulnerability that comes with trust, and about how patiently and coldly that trust can be exploited by those determined to take everything a person has built. Louise was not naive in any simple sense. She was a successful businesswoman who had spent a lifetime navigating property deals and financial arrangements. Yet the very sophistication of Al-Jundi's deception, built slowly across months, reinforced by fabricated wealth and fabricated relationships, was enough to override the warnings of the people who loved her most. In the years since her death, the case has drawn renewed public because how two ordinary men working in a kebab shop could construct such an elaborate scheme and carry it through to murder. But beneath the headlines about millions of pounds and wheelie bins lies a simpler, sadder truth. A mother of 2 sons went to a house believing she was closing a business deal and never came home. Her son Gregory's quiet suspicion about a strange text message, a small act of a child's intuition refusing to accept a lie, became one of the threads that eventually brought her killers to justice, even though it could never bring her back. Story 6. On the evening of November 6, 1998, Linda Marie Rutledge closed up for the night at Mr. B's Bar and Restaurant, a familiar little spot in Lexington, Kentucky, where she had spent time with friends after a long day. She was 43 years old, divorced, the mother of a son she adored, a regular presence at her church, and a woman whose life revolved largely around her family's small business, the Nixon Hearing Aid Center, which her parents, George and Velma Nixon, had built and which Linda helped run. Around 9 o'clock that night, she said her goodbyes and left the restaurant. She was believed to have driven to the Hearing Aid Center shortly afterward, perhaps to finish paperwork, perhaps simply to check on something before heading home. No one who loved her ever saw her alive again. What happened inside that small business on Malibu Drive over the following hours would remain one of the most painful unanswered questions in Lexington's history for nearly 3 decades, a mystery that would outlive not only the investigators who first worked it, but even, unknown to anyone at the time, the man responsible for it. At approximately 7:40 in the morning on November 7, 1998, the Lexington Fire Department received a call reporting a structure fire in the 100 block of Malibu Drive. Crews arrived to find heavy smoke pouring from the Nixon Hearing Aid Center, and firefighters moved quickly to force entry and knock down the flames before the building could be consumed entirely. It was a routine emergency response, the kind fire crews handle without knowing, in that first rush of adrenaline and smoke, what waits for them inside. What they found, once the fire was extinguished, was not routine at all. In the back hallway of the building, firefighters discovered the body of a woman. It was Linda Rutledge. The Fayette County Coroner's Office would later determine that she had not died from the fire or from smoke inhalation. She had been shot multiple times in the head. The fire, investigators concluded, had been set deliberately afterward, seemingly in an attempt to destroy evidence and obscure what had truly happened inside that building the night before. Investigators also determined that Linda had been physically assaulted before she was killed, a detail that added a further, terrible dimension to an already devastating crime. Her car was later found abandoned nearby, suggesting that she had arrived at the Hearing Aid Center as expected, perhaps even willingly, only to encounter someone whose presence she could not have anticipated and could not escape. For a family already grieving the sudden, violent loss of a daughter, a sister, and a mother, the days that followed brought no answers, only a widening silence. Lexington police opened a homicide investigation, canvassing the area, interviewing everyone who had seen Linda in her final hours, examining the physical evidence recovered from the burned building. A $1,000 reward was offered for information leading to an arrest, a modest sum that reflected, perhaps, how ordinary this crime initially appeared to those outside the family. One woman's murder in one small business, seemingly disconnected from anything larger. But there was no arrest. Weeks became months, and months became years. Linda Rutledge's murder became, and would remain for a long time, the only unsolved homicide in Lexington from that entire year. A case that detectives revisited periodically but could never crack, lacking the forensic tools that decades later would finally begin to unravel it. For Linda's son and her parents, the absence of resolution became its own kind of ongoing wound. There was no trial to attend, no face to confront, no name to carry the weight of what had happened to someone they loved. Investigators continued to review the file periodically over the years, re-entering evidence into updated databases as forensic technology advanced, following up on tips that trickled in and just as often led nowhere. It was the kind of case that never fully closes in the minds of detectives who worked it, even when active leads run dry, because somewhere in a records room sat physical evidence collected from that burned hallway, waiting for science to catch up to the crime. Nobody investigating Linda's death in the late 1990s, or even the early 2000s, could have known that her killer was not a local figure with ties to Lexington at all, but a transient, deeply dangerous man who moved constantly between states, changing names, using false identities, and leaving behind a trail of violence so scattered across the American South and Midwest that it would take investigators from multiple states, working independently for years, to even begin to see the pattern. Connecting them, that man was Robert Eugene Brashers, born March 13, 1958, in Newport News, Virginia, to Woody and Nellie Brashers. He grew up between Alabama and Indiana, and by all early accounts, nothing about his upbringing suggested the trail of devastation he would eventually leave behind. He served in the military for a period, then drifted into a life marked by increasing instability and violence. His documented criminal history began in 1985 in Port St. Lucie, Florida, when he lured a 24-year-old woman named Michelle Wilkerson into his car after meeting her at a bar. When she rejected his advances, he shot her twice. Remarkably, Wilkerson survived and was able to describe her attacker to police, leading to Brashers' arrest and a 12-year prison sentence for attempted murder. He was paroled in 1989, a decision that, in hindsight, allowed a man capable of extreme violence back into a society that had no idea what he would go on to do. By the early 1990s, Brashers had rebuilt an outward appearance of normalcy, marrying and eventually having a daughter, along with adopting 2 stepdaughters. But beneath that domestic surface, he was living a second, hidden life, one defined by transience, aliases, and a pattern of predatory violence that spanned an extraordinary geographic range. Investigators would later determine that he rarely committed crimes near wherever he was currently living, moved frequently between states, changed his name and used multiple birth certificates, and structured his life specifically to evade the kind of pattern recognition that might otherwise have caught him far sooner. On April 5, 1990, in Greenville, South Carolina, Brashers raped and murdered 28-year-old Genevieve Zatricki, leaving her body in a bathtub. It was one of the earliest known murders later attributed to him, though at the time it registered only as an isolated, unsolved tragedy in one city, disconnected from anything happening elsewhere. Then, on December 6, 1991, Brashers committed the crime that would eventually make him one of the most searched-for unidentified killers in American history. At the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop in Austin, Texas, he bound, gagged, and shot 4 teenage girls in the head: 13-year-old Amy Ayers, 15-year-old Sarah Harbison, and 17-year-olds Eliza Thomas and Jennifer Harbison, 2 of whom worked at the shop. He then set the building on fire, a chilling echo of the tactic he would use again 7 years later in Lexington. The yogurt shop murders, as they came to be known, devastated the Austin community and became one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in Texas history, so notorious that they would eventually be the subject of documentaries, extensive investigations, and tragically, the wrongful accusation and prosecution of 4 innocent men whose lives were upended by a justice system desperately searching for answers it did not yet have the tools to find. Brasher's continued his pattern of violence largely undetected. In March 1997 in Memphis, Tennessee, he took a family hostage, raping a 14-year-old girl during the ordeal. On March 28, 1998, in Portageville, Missouri, he raped and murdered 12-year-old Megan Scherer and killed her mother, 38-year-old Sherry Scherer. Then, on November 7, 1998, he arrived in Lexington, Kentucky, where he raped and murdered 43-year-old Linda Marie Rutledge inside the Nixon Hearing Aid Center, setting the building on fire in an attempt to hide what he had done. Brasher's long run of violence finally reached its conclusion just over 2 months after Linda's murder. In January 1999, in Kennett, Missouri, police arrived at a motel with an arrest warrant connected to an unrelated crime. Rather than surrender, Brasher's took his wife, his daughter, and his 2 stepdaughters hostage inside the motel room, initiating a tense standoff with law enforcement that stretched on for hours. Eventually, negotiators convinced Brasher's to release his hostages unharmed. But rather than face arrest, he turned a .380 caliber pistol, the same type of weapon he had used to kill Amy Ayres years earlier in Austin, on himself. He died from the self-inflicted wound, with some reports indicating he succumbed to his injuries several days later, on January 19, 1999. At the time of his death, Robert Eugene Brasher's was not known to be a serial killer at all. To the communities in Missouri and the family he had briefly held hostage, he was simply a violent man who had chosen death over capture for a crime that, on its surface, appeared far smaller than the horrors he had actually committed across 4 states. His death, ruled a suicide, closed the book on him personally, but it left behind a scattered constellation of unsolved murders and unanswered questions that would take investigators decades and remarkable advances in forensic science to finally connect. The truth about Robert Eugene Brasher's began to surface gradually, years after his death, through the patient application of forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that uses DNA evidence to trace family trees and identify unknown suspects, even when no direct match exists in a criminal database. In 2018, investigators first identified Brasher's through this method, tying him to the earlier murders of Genevieve Zetricki and the Scherers, a breakthrough that began to reveal the shape of a serial killer whose crimes had for decades been treated as isolated, unrelated tragedies scattered across different states and jurisdictions. The most significant breakthrough, however, came later, and it began not in Kentucky but in Texas. Detective Daniel Jackson of the Austin Police Department had continued working the yogurt shop murders case for years, revisiting old evidence with the kind of persistence that cold cases demand. Sitting quietly in the case file was a single .380 shell casing, recovered from the scene back in 1991, which had never been entered into the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, a database that allows law enforcement agencies across the country to compare ballistic evidence and identify weapons used in multiple crimes. When Jackson finally submitted that casing to the network, the response came within hours. The system flagged a match to a shell casing recovered from an entirely different crime scene, one nearly 900 miles away and 7 years later. The burned Hearing Aid Center in Lexington, Kentucky, where Linda Rutledge had been murdered in 1998. The same gun, a .380 caliber pistol, had been used to kill 4 teenage girls in Austin in 1991, and had reappeared 7 years later to kill Linda Rutledge in Kentucky. This ballistic connection alone was extraordinary, but investigators needed more to be certain. Jackson and his team revisited the DNA evidence from both cases, and this forensic review, combined with a DNA profile that had already linked Brasher's to a separate homicide in South Carolina, pointed unmistakably to the same man. Lexington investigators, working alongside their counterparts in Austin, conducted renewed DNA testing on evidence preserved from Linda's case for over 2.5 decades, evidence that had waited patiently through years of advancing technology for the moment it could finally speak. On September 26, 2025, the Austin Police Department announced publicly that Robert Eugene Brashers had been identified through DNA evidence as the man responsible for the yogurt shop murders, closing a case that had haunted the city and the families of Amy Ayers, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Jennifer Harbison for over 3 decades. The announcement also brought long overdue vindication to 4 men who had been wrongfully accused and, in some cases, prosecuted for the crime years earlier, a separate injustice that the true resolution of the case finally helped to correct. Then, in early January 2026, the Lexington Police Department made its own announcement. Detectives confirmed that the ballistic and DNA evidence connecting the Austin shell casing to the one recovered from the Nixon Hearing Aid Center had been conclusively verified. Robert Eugene Brashers, dead for 27 years, was formally identified as the man who murdered Linda Marie Rutledge on the night of November 6th into the early morning of November 7th, 1998. There would be no trial. There would be no verdict read aloud in a courtroom, no moment where Linda's family could look her killer in the eye and speak about what his violence had taken from them. Because Brashers had died in 1999, decades before his identification, the Lexington Police Department could only state, in the careful language of an official release, that if he were alive today, he would be arrested and charged with Linda's murder. It was in its way both an ending and an incomplete one, a form of justice arriving without the courtroom drama that usually accompanies it, but justice nonetheless, in the sense that the truth had finally, after 27 years, been brought into the light. For Linda Rutledge's family, who had carried the uncertainty of her unsolved murder for nearly 3 decades, the announcement offered something that no arrest or trial could have guaranteed: a name, a face, an understanding of what had actually happened to her that November night, and confirmation that she had not simply been an isolated victim of random, inexplicable violence, but one casualty among many claimed by a man whose predatory pattern had, for far too long, evaded detection, precisely because of how widely and methodically he had scattered his crimes. Investigators and forensic experts who worked to untangle the connection between Austin and Lexington described the resolution as a profound demonstration of what patient, cross-jurisdictional collaboration and advancing technology could accomplish, even decades after a crime had gone cold. A single overlooked shell casing, finally entered into a national database, had connected 2 cases separated by hundreds of miles and 7 years, cases that on the surface appeared to share nothing beyond a killer's chosen method of destroying evidence with fire. That single piece of evidence, sitting quietly in a file for 34 years, ultimately gave voice to victims who could no longer speak for themselves, allowing investigators to finally answer the question that had haunted 2 states for a generation. Linda Marie Rutledge was, in the end, believed by investigators to be among the last known victims of Robert Eugene Brashers before his death, a woman whose life ended in a small hearing aid center on an ordinary November night, caught in the path of a man whose violence had already stretched across Florida, South Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, and Missouri before he ever arrived in Kentucky. Her murder, once Lexington's lone unsolved case from an entire year, became instead a crucial piece of a much larger, far darker puzzle, one that took 27 years, remarkable forensic persistence, and the quiet determination of investigators unwilling to let a shell casing sit unexamined, to finally, fully solve. For her family, the resolution came without the ceremony of a courtroom verdict, but it brought something no less meaningful: certainty, an end to decades of not knowing, and the knowledge that Linda had not been forgotten, that somewhere, patiently, people had continued looking for the truth on her behalf, long after most would have assumed the trail had gone permanently cold. Story 7. The heart of Australia is a vast, unforgiving expanse of red earth and cobalt sky, a landscape of raw, primordial beauty that stretches to an endless horizon. It is a place where distances are measured in days, not hours, and where the silence is so profound it feels like a physical presence. This is the outback, a land of ancient rock formations, resilient scrub, and a solitude that can be both liberating and terrifying. Along the spine of this continent runs the Stuart Highway, a lonely ribbon of asphalt that cuts a determined path through the wilderness, connecting the southern city of Adelaide to Darwin in the tropical north. For travelers, it is a rite of passage, a journey into the soul of Australia. For Peter Falconio and Joan Lees, it was the adventure of a lifetime, the penultimate leg of a globe-trotting odyssey that had brought them from their home in England to the sunburnt country. But on a cold winter's night in July 2001, this road would lead them not to the natural wonders they sought, but into an encounter with a darkness as vast and as desolate as the landscape itself. Peter, 28, was a man on the cusp of his future. Born in the West Yorkshire town of Hepworth, he was the third of 4 sons in a close-knit family, a young man with an easy smile and an adventurous spirit. He had met Joan Lees, a vibrant and independent woman 5 months his junior, in a nightclub in 1996, and their connection was immediate and deep. They built a life together in Brighton, where Peter studied, and by the turn of the millennium, they were ready to see the world. On November 15, 2000, they set off, their passports stamped with the names of far-flung destinations: Nepal, Singapore, Thailand, Cambodia. Australia was their final grand stop. They arrived in Sydney in January 2001 on a working holiday visa, finding jobs and immersing themselves in the rhythm of the city. But the true call of Australia lay beyond the urban sprawl. In late June, they bought their ticket to freedom, a bright orange 1987 Volkswagen Combi van. It was old and a little battered, but it was their home on wheels, the vessel that would carry them across the continent on a meticulously planned road trip from Sydney to Brisbane, via the great southern and central heartlands. Their families back in England were anxious. The news from Australia had recently been filled with stories of violence against travelers: the infamous backpacker murders, the Port Arthur massacre, a deadly fire at a hostel in Childers. But Peter and Joan were young, in love, and filled with the invincible optimism of adventurers. The risks seemed distant, abstract, shadows in a land of brilliant sunshine. By mid-July, they were deep in the Northern Territory, the Combi chugging its way north along the Stuart Highway. On the evening of Saturday, July 14th, they were making their way from the tiny outpost of Barrow Creek towards the Devil's Marbles, a sacred site of giant, precariously balanced granite boulders. Peter was at the wheel, his silhouette framed against the fading light of the desert sunset. Joan sat beside him, the vast, empty landscape scrolling past her window. As twilight bled into a star-dusted darkness, Joan became aware of a vehicle behind them. A white, 4-wheel drive Toyota Uda with a distinctive green canopy had been tailing them for some time, ever since they had stopped at the Barrow Creek Roadhouse. It was not unusual on this long, straight road. They expected to be overtaken. But as the Toyota pulled alongside their lumbering Combi, the driver, a man with a thick mustache and a shaggy appearance, began gesticulating wildly, pointing urgently towards the back of their van. Peter, concerned, slowed the Combi and pulled over onto the dusty shoulder of the highway. The Toyota sped past and stopped a short distance ahead. Peter got out and walked towards the other driver, a solitary figure against the immense backdrop of the desert night. Joan watched as the 2 men met between the vehicles. After a moment, the man explained what he had seen. Sparks, he said, were shooting out of the Combi's exhaust pipe. It was a common enough problem with an old vehicle, a plausible reason to be flagged down in the middle of nowhere. The 2 men walked to the rear of the van to investigate. As they disappeared behind the vehicle, Joan, ever practical, slid over into the driver's seat. Peter had asked her to rev the engine, to help diagnose the problem. She put her hand on the key, ready. The air was still, the only sound the faint hum of the world. Then a noise. A sharp, cracking bang that tore through the silence. Joanne's first thought was that the exhaust had backfired, a loud but harmless report confirming the stranger's diagnosis. It was a logical assumption, the kind of thought one has in the last moments of a normal life. But the man did not call out. Peter did not reappear. A beat of silence stretched, then another. And then, the stranger was at her window. In his right hand, he held a silver handgun. The world tilted on its axis. The quiet desert night, the friendly stranger, the concern over the van. It was all a facade, a carefully constructed trap. The man's face, now seen up close, was hard and weathered, his eyes cold. He motioned with the gun, and Joanne, paralyzed by a fear so absolute it was almost surreal, could do nothing but obey. He climbed into the combi, the small space suddenly claustrophobic, filled with his menacing presence and the metallic glint of the weapon. He ordered her to put her hands behind her back. She complied, her mind racing, trying to process the impossible. He produced a set of black cable ties and cinched them tight around her wrists, the plastic biting into her skin. He tried to bind her feet, to tape her mouth, but a primal instinct for survival surged through her shock. She fought back, kicking and struggling, a desperate, frantic resistance against the inevitable. He overpowered her, dragging her from the familiar comfort of their van and towards his own vehicle. As she was pulled across the dusty ground, she noticed a dog in the man's Toyota, a detail so mundane it was jarring in its context. He forced her into the Uta, pushing her between the front seats and into the rear footwell. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something animalistic and malevolent. A sack was thrown over her head, plunging her into a suffocating darkness. In that blackness, a single, horrifying thought crystallized in her mind: rape. He was going to rape her, and then he was going to kill her, just as he had killed Peter. But the gunman was distracted. Joanne heard him moving around outside the vehicle. He seemed to be dealing with something, or someone. A chilling realization dawned on her. He was moving Peter's body. In that split second of his inattention, her will to live ignited like a wildfire. It was now or never. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she scrambled out of the Uta and ran. She ran blindly, desperately, into the thorny scrub and the pitch-black maw of the Australian night. The gunman shouted, his voice a furious roar that cut through the darkness. He had a torch, its powerful beam slicing through the bush as he began to search for her. Joanne threw herself to the ground, crawling under low-lying shrubs, the thorns tearing at her clothes and skin. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the beam of light swept past her hiding place, once, twice, a third time. He was hunting her. She was prey. For what felt like an eternity, she lay frozen in the dirt, the silence of the desert now her only shield. Eventually, the sound of the Toyota's engine roared to life, its headlights cutting a swathe across the landscape as it drove away, leaving her utterly alone in the vast, dark wilderness. For hours, Joanne remained hidden, too terrified to move. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, sounded like his returning footsteps. The cold of the desert night seeped into her bones, but her fear was a fire that kept the numbness at bay. Finally, summoning every last reserve of her courage, she made her way back to the highway. The road was a desolate black ribbon under the cold light of the moon. She waited, a small, trembling figure in the immense emptiness. At 12:35 a.m., a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. It was a road train, one of the colossal multi-trailer trucks that thunder through the outback. She ran into the middle of the road, waving her arms frantically. The driver, Vince Miller, saw her just in time, his brakes hissing as the massive vehicle shuddered to a halt. When he and his co-driver opened the door, they found a young woman in hysterics. Her hands were still bound behind her back, her face was bruised, and her body was covered in scratches. Through her sobs, she told them a story so horrific it was almost unbelievable. Her boyfriend had been shot, and she had been abducted at gunpoint before managing to escape. Miller took her to the safety of the Barrow Creek Roadhouse, the very place she and Peter had stopped just hours before in another lifetime. The police in Alice Springs, 300 kilometers to the south, were called at 1:30 a.m., but in the vastness of the territory, help is not swift. The first officers arrived at 4:20 a.m. When dawn broke, the scene of the crime was a chilling tableau. The orange combi van was found hidden some 80 meters in the scrub, a clear attempt by the attacker to conceal it from the road. On the highway itself, police found a dark, dirt-covered pool of blood. A laboratory analysis would later confirm it was Peter's. It was a significant amount of blood, enough to indicate a fatal injury. But there was no body, no murder weapon. Peter Falconio had simply vanished. The investigation began, but it was hampered from the start by the tyranny of distance. Roadblocks were not established on the dozen likely exit roads from the district for a full 8 hours after Joanne's rescue, giving the killer a massive head start. Police, Aboriginal trackers, and volunteers scoured the area. The trackers, men with an almost supernatural ability to read the land, found Joanne's footprints, a clear trail of her desperate flight and hiding. But they found no trace of Peter and no tracks belonging to the gunman. The case exploded in the media, both in Australia and the UK. A young, attractive British couple attacked in the outback. It was a story that tapped into primal fears and the dark folklore of the frontier. Joanne Lees, the sole survivor and witness, was thrust into an unforgiving international spotlight. Initially, her story was framed as one of incredible bravery and survival against all odds. But soon the narrative began to shift. In police interviews and press conferences, Joanne appeared calm, detached, almost cold. Her demeanor did not match the public's expectation of a grieving, traumatized victim. Inconsistencies, some minor and some more significant, emerged in her statements. She struggled to describe the attacker's dog, the exact model of his Toyota, details that were lost in the terrifying blur of the event. The police released CCTV footage from a service station in Alice Springs, showing a man who matched the general description, but Joanne couldn't be certain it was him. The media and a significant portion of the public turned on her. The whispers grew into a roar of suspicion. Was she telling the truth? Was she somehow involved? Parallels were drawn to the notorious case of Lindy Chamberlain, another woman who had faced public condemnation after claiming a dingo had taken her baby in the very same outback. Joanne was vilified, her character assassinated in tabloids and on talk shows. She was a woman who had survived a horrific ordeal, only to be subjected to another, trialed by media. She's a very brave woman, and she deserves a lot more credit than she's ever been given, lead investigator Colleen Gwynn would later state. But at the time, Joanne stood largely alone against a tide of doubt. Despite the scrutiny, the investigation pushed forward. A reward of $250,000 was offered, but it yielded little. The only solid piece of forensic evidence was a small trace of unidentified male DNA on Joanne's t-shirt, and related traces on the cable ties and the combi's gear stick. For months, the case went cold. The trail of the man in the white Toyota had disappeared into the vast emptiness of the Australian continent. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic confession or a lucky break, but from painstaking police work. Investigators began focusing on the registered owners of Toyota Land Cruiser models matching the description, and on the men who had been identified by callers as potentially being the man in the CCTV footage. One name that came up was Bradley John Murdoch. Murdoch was a 43-year-old mechanic and truck driver from Broome, Western Australia, a man who lived on the fringes, involved in the illicit cross-country trade of cannabis. He was a big, intimidating man with a drooping mustache and a history of violence. He had previously served time for shooting at a group of Aboriginal football fans and had been acquitted of the rape of a mother and her 12-year-old daughter in South Australia just before his trial for Falconio's murder, a fact the jury would never hear. He drove a white Toyota and had a dog, a Dalmatian. Police interviewed Murdoch in Broome in November 2001, but at the time, there wasn't enough to connect him directly, and no DNA sample was taken. The crucial link came months later, in May 2002, when investigators apprehended Murdoch's drug-running accomplice. The accomplice, seeking a deal, began to talk, providing details that placed Murdoch firmly in the frame. Murdoch, sensing the net was closing, vanished. He was finally arrested in August 2002 on an unrelated charge in South Australia. The key to unlocking the case was DNA. Investigators now had their prime suspect. and they needed to match his DNA to the sample found on Joanne's shirt. The result was staggering. The DNA was 150 quadrillion times more likely to belong to Murdoch than anyone else. His DNA was also found on the gearstick of the combi, which the killer had driven into the bush. The man who had haunted Joanne's nightmares and the investigation for over a year finally had a name and a face. The trial of Bradley John Murdoch began on October 17, 2005, in the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory in Darwin. The media interest was so immense that the courthouse had to be specially renovated to accommodate the throng of journalists from around the world. Murdoch pleaded not guilty to the murder of Peter Falconio and the assault and attempted kidnap of Joanne Lees. The prosecution, led by Rex Wild QC, faced a significant challenge. This was a circumstantial case. They had no body, no murder weapon, no confession, and no eyewitness to the murder itself. Their case rested on two pillars: the harrowing testimony of Joanne Lees and the power of forensic science. When Joanne took the stand, the courtroom was silent. She recounted the events of that terrible night with a composure that her detractors had once mistaken for coldness, but which was now clearly the steel of a survivor. She identified Murdoch as her attacker, looking directly at the man who had torn her life apart. Her testimony was powerful, consistent, and deeply moving. The defense, for its part, tried to dismantle her credibility and the forensic evidence. They argued that the DNA match could have been the result of an accidental transfer. Murdoch, they claimed, had stopped at a Red Rooster fast food restaurant in Alice Springs to buy chicken for himself and his dog. By coincidence, Joanne and Peter had also stopped there. Perhaps, the defense suggested, Murdoch's DNA had been transferred to Joanne then, or was even planted by unknown persons. The theory was tenuous, a desperate attempt to create doubt where science had provided near certainty. It was later reported that Murdoch, while in prison, claimed to have a severe allergy to chicken, a detail that starkly contradicted his own defense. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. On December 13, 2005, they returned with a unanimous verdict. Bradley John Murdoch was guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a non-parole period of 28 years. Justice, after 4 long and painful years, had been served, but one gaping wound remained. Peter Falconio was still missing. Murdoch, maintaining his innocence to the last, refused to reveal what he had done with Peter's body. Over the years, he launched several appeals, all of which were dismissed. In 2016, the Northern Territory enacted no body, no parole legislation, meaning Murdoch would never be eligible for release unless he disclosed the location of his victims' remains. Still, he remained silent. The vast outback, which had been the scene of his crime, now served as his co-conspirator, jealously guarding his final, terrible secret. Peter's parents, Luciano and Joan Falconio, lived through years of quiet agony, their grief compounded by the inability to bring their son home. "The most important thing to my family now is to find Peter's body," Luciano said after the verdict, a plea that would echo unanswered for decades. On July 15, 2025, one day after the 24th anniversary of his son's murder, the Falconio family received news. Bradley John Murdoch, aged 67, had died from throat cancer in a palliative care unit in Alice Springs Hospital. The man who had brought so much pain into their lives was gone. His death brought a sense of relief, a weight lifted. "We don't want to let him ruin our lives any more than he already has," his parents said. But it was a bittersweet closure. Murdoch had taken his secret to the grave. The mystery of Peter Falconio's final resting place endures, a lingering ghost in the red dust of the Australian interior. A reward of $500,000 for information leading to his remains still stands, a testament to the police's vow to never give up the search. Somewhere out in that vast, silent land, under the brilliant canopy of the Southern Cross, Peter lies waiting. For his family, the journey that began on a lonely stretch of highway continues, a search not for justice, which has been done, but for a place to finally say goodbye. The silence of the outback holds the answer, but it is a silence that may never be broken.